Welcome to my 2024 prediction if Donald Trump had won back in 2020. And there we go. So as you can see, a lot of the states that trended to the left in 2020 continue to trend to the left in 2024. Let's just go to Colorado. So Gavin Newsom, who would probably be the Democrat nominee in this timeline, he does quite well in Colorado, and I see him winning here by at least 13%. It could even go up to 15%, while for Virginia, another state that Pence would not do that well in, I think he will be tied to the Trump administration too much, so he doesn't gain that much in this timeline in many areas. So I see Gavin Newsom, or whoever the Democrat nominee is, winning Virginia barely by a safe margin of 12%. And lastly, for Maine at large, here's a big issue for Mike Pence, who would likely be the GOP nominee, kind of like what Reagan and Bush did. Gavin Newsom does quite well in Maine at large, and he makes it go from 9% to 12%, but it's mostly about Mike Pence not doing well in this area of the country, to be honest. And yeah, that's really about it. Montana's big close, but still a safe state. And now for the likely states. So the two noteworthy at the moment are Kansas and Missouri. I think Mike Pence, if Trump had won in 2020, these states continue to go barely to the left, I think. I'm not too sure how much they vote to the left in 2020, but if they continue the trend that they did from 2016 to 2020, then yeah, they would drop to a likely margin barely, I think around 11% for both of these states. And for the other likely states, South Carolina and Alaska, both of them, just like in 2020, I see them voting to the left once again, which is a big problem for the GOP. And I see they do go by a likely margin in this timeline, of course. And they drop, I think South Carolina drops, I'm not too sure if it's below 10%, but I could see it being something like 9.8% or something like that. Well, Alaska, it's really interesting because I do think they drop down to 8%. And for Iowa, so Iowa, I think it could be a lean state in this timeline. Don't get me wrong, but I still see Iowa, the rural areas, voting for the Republican Party enough to the point which even Mike Pence would win here barely by a likely margin of 5 to 7%. While for the Democrats, I think in Minnesota, you could see Minnesota go by as much as 9%, but I doubt that happens. But here's the issue for Newsom. He is quite weak in the Rust Belt. I mean, both candidates are. I think both Mike Pence and Newsom quite men the Rust Belt. But I still see Gavin Newsom winning here by 6 to 8%, but I'm leaning towards 6.5%. Oh wait, I almost forgot about New Hampshire. So, New Hampshire, it did trend quite to the left in 2020. I'm not too sure. New Hampshire is one of those states that can really go anywhere in elections. Kind of hard to predict, but I still see them, voting for Gavin Newsom by a likely margin. And yeah, so let's just go to the last likely state, which is New Mexico. So in 2024, in this timeline where there's a lot of voter fatigue for the GOP, I still see New Mexico barely voting to the right of 2020. So it's mostly because of the Latino trend. I still see Newsom winning here by a likely margin, but I would not be surprised if it's by something like 9%, unlike 2020. So for the lean states, you know what? Let's just talk about two noteworthy ones. So Texas and Florida. So Mike Pence would try to get some of the establishment supports in both of these states, but he would just fail. I think he will be too tied to the Trump administration, which at that point would probably be quite unpopular because that's what usually happens at the end of 2 terms. And what I think would happen in Texas is that it is barely a lean margin. In my opinion, I don't think the turnout by the Trump Republicans would be enough for the state. And Pence still wins it, of course, but he only wins it by 3 to 5%. And yeah, so let's just go to the following lean states. So for Ohio, I really think that Ohio would drop to a lean margin. Mike Pence just doesn't have the Rust Belt appeal that Trump had. He would still get some support because of the endorsement he would get from Donald Trump. I still think, unlike Iowa, the numbers really are not solid for the GOP in this state. And Mike Pence still wins it, mostly because kind of how weak Gavin Newsom still is in the Rust Belt, but Mike Pence wins Ohio by 3 to 5% in this timeline. And now for the state of Michigan. So Michigan, Gavin Newsom will do quite well, I think. He will do quite well with the minorities, while Mike Pence just does quite poorly. Not poorly, but does pretty meh with white working class voters, which is why I see Gavin Newsom easily winning Michigan. He could even push towards the margin of 3 to 5%, but I think it's something like 2.5% to 4.5%. It really depends on how well he does in the Rust Belt and who he picks, who they pick as their running mates. And let's just go talk about more the Latino trend and how they would do in this alternate 2024. So for the state of Florida, it would be really close. I think Mike Pence would 100% not do as well as what Trump did in 2020. I think it would probably be more like 2016, where it's barely a lean margin. I think the Latino trend still happens in this timeline, by the way. I still think it goes through. It's not as bad because of Gavin Newsom, but I still see Mike Pence winning here. It could also be a tilt state, but I don't see Newsom having that. Maybe if it's Roy Cooper or someone else. But because it's Gavin Newsom, Mike Pence wins here by a lean margin of 1% to 3% at most, but I'm probably going to say 2.5%. And talking about the Hispanic vote for the state of Nevada, so Gavin Newsom will do quite well in this state because it's a neighboring state and, you know, he has high name popularity or recognition. So, unlike Florida, the Latino trend is not as bad in Nevada, but I think it would be a repeat of 2016 and 2020, where I think Nevada votes probably the same as 2020 and 2016. So in my opinion, Nevada, they vote here for Newsom by a margin of, I'm guessing, 2.1% to 2.7%. I don't think much changes. Gavin Newsom still wins here. And let's move back to the Rust Belt. So for Pennsylvania, it was a state that Biden did quite well in 2020, and I expect Newsom to still win the state of Pennsylvania, but he doesn't do as well as what most people would think. I think Newsom barely wins it by a lean margin of 1%. He does okay with the working class, but Trump voters still kind of turn up in the Rust Belt to a certain degree, and that's why it's still quite close. And now for the 2nd district of Maine. So Maine 2nd district, it would go Mike Pence, in my opinion, barely. I think you would see a lot of the populist Obama-Trump voters just feel mad about Pence, which is why I see Mike Pence only winning here by a lean margin, bear in mind. So, which is why, you know, Maine at large safe. While for the 2nd district, Mike Pence still wins it here, but only by 3 to 5%. And now, talking about districts, let's go to the 2nd district of Nebraska. So, in 2016, it went to Trump barely. In 2020, it went to Biden by a decent margin. So I think Gavin Newsom still wins it here, the governor of California, but not as much as Biden did in 2020. I think Newsom wins here by 3 to 5%. It's really just because Newsom does better in the West Coast and the East Coast, but not as good in the Rust Belt area. And yeah, so that's it for the lean states, if I'm not mistaken. So, and also, by the way I see Trump winning in this timeline is he gets the 3 closest states from 2020. So he wins Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Then the election goes to the House and the Senate, and yeah, Trump wins, and it's just more chaotic. So for the high tilt states of North Carolina, so in 2020, Trump barely won by a lean margin. Even though you would think Mike Pence would do quite better in the South, I don't think the Trump Republicans would be as enthusiastic in 2024. I think voter fatigue, as I've said before, really starts to come in for the GOP, which is why I still see Mike Pence winning there, barely, but only by a tilt margin, which is kind of crazy to think about. And for the other states, In the South, let's just go to Georgia. So Georgia trended quite a lot in 2020, from 2016 to 2020, and I still see that trend coming along in 2024. And because of the lack of appeal towards many suburban and rural areas by the GOP, I think Gavin Newsom is able to win here by a tilt margin. I think he does quite well. I see the trends helping Newsom quite a lot, and he wins here by 0.5%. I will say, if this was Pete Buttigieg, who I think would get second place in the Democratic primary, then this would be a toss-up, but because it's Gavin Newsom, he barely wins here. And now for the other two states, for Arizona. So Arizona, I think 2020 was really kind of a fluke because of the Biden coalition having the McCain Republicans. And I think it's one of the few states that trends to the right in 2024. I think, 2024, of course. And Mike Pence is actually able to win this state. I think he does. I think Mike Pence does better in the state of Arizona compared to Donald Trump. I think the establishment ties to Mike Pence helps him quite a lot in this state, so he wins Arizona by the same margin as Georgia of 0.5%. And now for Wisconsin, which it's really close, which is weird to think, but Wisconsin, it would once again be quite a competitive state, like in 2016 and 2020, and in my opinion, it's really a true toss-up, but I see Gavin Newsom barely winning here by a tilt margin of 0.25% to 0.5%. Mike Pence just doesn't have it. And as you can see, Governor Newsom, or whoever the Democrats nominate, likely win with 292 electoral votes, while Vice President Mike Pence gets 246 electoral votes. Thank you for watching this alternate video, and see you next time.